Evelyn Carter burned his letter without reading the last paragraph. She had gotten far enough to see the words "I suggest you reconsider, and the house is not suitable, and you are under no obligation." She folded it once, held it over the candle on her nightstand, watched it catch. Then she finished packing her bag. She had already bought the train ticket. She had already given up her room in Missouri. She had already buried her mother 6 weeks ago and stood alone at the graveside because there was no one left who would stand beside her. She was not going back. She was not going anywhere but forward. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to this channel and stay until the very end. Because what happens between Evelyn Carter and Caleb Whitaker is going to reach into your chest and rearrange something. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The train was 40 minutes late, and Caleb Whitaker had spent every one of those minutes rehearsing how to say goodbye to a woman he had never met. He had the speech ready. He had worked it out over 3 days. Tested it on the empty kitchen, revised it twice. It was honest without being cruel. It was firm without being cold. It gave her every exit with her dignity intact. The house is not ready. I cannot in good conscience ask you to live in these conditions. I have arranged a room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house at my expense, for as long as you need it. If you choose to return to Missouri, I will cover the fare. If you choose to wait while repairs are completed, I will not pressure you either way. The decision is entirely yours. Clean, responsible, safe. He had the words memorized. What he had not prepared for was her face. When the second car door opened and Evelyn Carter stepped down onto the platform, travel bag in her right hand, smaller bag on her left shoulder, dark hair pinned under a practical hat, dress worn but pressed, she looked up and found him immediately. Like she already knew exactly where he would be standing. And she looked at him without a single trace of uncertainty. Not relief, not nervousness, not the careful hopefulness he had expected from a woman arriving to marry a stranger in a state she'd never seen. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she has already made her decision about. Caleb forgot the first 2 sentences of his speech. He walked toward her because there was nothing else to do. "Miss Carter." He touched the brim of his hat. "Caleb Whitaker, Miss Whitaker." She nodded once. "I recognized you from the photograph. The photograph is 3 years old. You still look like yourself." A pause. "That's worth something." He cleared his throat, reached for the speech. "Miss Carter, before we go any further, I sent a letter. I don't know if you had the chance to. I received it." He stopped. She held his gaze without flinching. "The day before I left. Then you read it." "I read most of it." Something in her voice made him pause. "Most of it?" "The parts that mattered." She set her large bag down on the platform between them. "The house is damaged. The roof needs significant repair. You don't believe it's suitable for habitation, and you wanted to give me the chance to turn around." She said it the way some reads a list they've already memorized. "Did I miss anything important?" Caleb opened his mouth. Closed it. "The east bedroom," he said finally. "The ceiling is there's canvas where the ceiling should be." "Canvas." She repeated the word without expression. "How long?" "Until Friday when the carpenter comes." "Maybe longer, depending on the beam replacement." "And the rest of the house?" "Livable." "The kitchen is solid. Main room is fine. My bedroom." He stopped. Started again. "There are 2 other rooms that are intact." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her large bag. "Then we're not sleeping outside," she said. "That's a start." She looked toward the wagon at the edge of the station yard. "Is that yours?" "Yes, that's mine." "Then let's go." She was already walking. "Tell me about the beam on the way." Caleb stood on the platform for exactly 3 seconds. Behind him, old Pete Larson, who'd been sitting on the bench outside the ticket window, eating a biscuit, and watching all of this with undisguised attention, very slowly stopped chewing. Caleb picked up the bag she'd left and followed her. He had not said a single word of his prepared speech. She asked him 37 questions before they reached the ranch. Not polite questions. Not the kind of careful getting-to-know-you conversation he had been steeling himself for. Real questions, specific questions, the kind that required real answers. How deep was the well? Which direction did the worst winter wind come from? Was the barn built before or after the main house? And why did that matter? And what was the foundation material? And had the creek ever run dry in August? Caleb answered every single one because she didn't give him room not to. The cellar's too small, he said at some point, surprising himself. He hadn't planned to admit that. I've known it 2 years. It's on the list. What else is on the list? He exhaled through his nose. The north pasture fence needs replacing. The well cover is rotting. 3 boards on the east porch are soft enough to go through. A pause. The house isn't the only thing that needs work. She didn't react to that the way he expected. No visible concern. No quiet recalculation. Most things worth having take work, she said. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She was watching the road ahead. Hands folded in her lap, dust settling on her traveling dress. Completely unbothered. You say that now, he said carefully. You haven't seen it yet, no. She turned and looked at him directly. But I've heard your voice when you talk about it. He kept his eyes on the road. You love that ranch. She said it the way someone states a fact. A man doesn't list every flaw in something he's ashamed of. He lists every flaw in something he's afraid of losing. The words landed somewhere he wasn't ready for them. He didn't answer. She didn't push. They rode the last 10 minutes in silence. And it was not the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of 2 people who had both said something true and needed a moment to let it settle. The ranch appeared at the top of the long hill, first the roof. Then the walls, then all of it laid out across the flat ground below. The barn and fences and the distant slow shapes of cattle in the afternoon heat. Caleb watched her face. He couldn't stop himself. He needed to see the moment it landed. The missing shingles, the warped east porch, the canvas visible even at this distance over the east bedroom. Flapping faintly in the breeze like a flag of every failure he'd been cataloging in his own head for 3 weeks. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. Long enough that his hands tightened on the reins. Long enough that he started hearing everything through her eyes, the damaged roof. The unfinished repairs, the general evidence of a man who had been managing too much alone for too long. It's bigger than I thought, she said. He blinked. What? The property. She leaned forward slightly in the seat. Studying it. From your letters I had a sense of the acreage. But seeing it, she paused. You've built something real here. Mr. Whitaker, you can see the roof damage from here. Yes, her voice didn't change. I can see the work too. He looked at her profile, the steadiness of it. The complete absence of performance, and something shifted in his chest. Something he didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to examine. He clicked his tongue at the horse and started down the hill. She walked through the house the way her father had taught her. He learned this later about her father, about the carpenter's trade she had grown up inside of. The language of structures and load-bearing walls, and the difference between damage that was cosmetic and damage that was serious. But in those first minutes, watching her move through each room with that deliberate, unhurried attention touching the wall joints, testing the floor with her weight, opening doors slowly and noting how they sat in their frames, he only knew that she was not afraid. She went into the east bedroom, stewed in the center of it. Looked up at the canvas, tacked over the the square of rough fabric that was all that stood between that room and the Colorado sky. Caleb stood in the doorway. He waited. You'll want this closed before September, she said. This elevation you'll get frost by mid-October. Carpenter's coming Friday. What's the delay? He's finishing a job town. I couldn't afford to pull him sooner. She nodded slowly. Still studying the ceiling. What lumber do you have on hand? Some. Not enough for the full beam, but show me. He looked at the back of her head. Miss Carter, I know what I'm asking. She turned. My father built and repaired structures for 30 years. I'm not suggesting I replace the beam myself. I'm suggesting that if I understand what you have, I might be able to tell you whether we can start before Friday. She held his gaze. Can you show me the lumber or not? A beat of silence. Barn, he said, follow me. She was already moving. They spent an hour in the barn. Evelyn went through the lumber, the way she had gone through the house methodically. Practically, without drama. She ran her hands along the boards. Checked for warping, separated what was usable from what wasn't. Stacked things in an order that made immediate sense once she explained it. Which she did without being asked. Caleb held the lantern and answered her questions and tried not to think about how long it had been since another person had stood in this barn and cared about what was in it. This is enough to frame the ceiling in the east bedroom, she said finally. Straightening up. Not for the beam replacement, you'll still need Harmon for that. But enough to start. The canvas comes down, the frame goes up. You stop losing heat through that room every night. She brushed her hands on her skirt. 2 days of work, maybe less. Caleb looked at the lumber she had sorted. I thought it was short. You were counting wrong. She said it without judgment. You were measuring for the full job. We're not doing the full job yet. We're doing the part that stops the bleeding. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Stop the bleeding first, he said slowly. Then fix everything else. She picked up her smaller bag from where she'd set it by the barn door. That's how my father always put it. Caleb set the lantern down on the workbench. Outside, the sun was dropping. The cattle were moving toward the water trough in the long golden light. Their shapes familiar and steady against the flat horizon. We should get dinner started, he said. Yes. She was already heading for the door. I'll handle the kitchen. Come when you're ready. He watched her walk across the yard toward the house, this woman from Missouri, who had arrived 6 hours ago to a broken roof and a nervous rancher, and had spent the afternoon sorting lumber instead of crying, and he did not move for almost a full minute. He had been certain, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the sight of the canvas ceiling would be the moment. The breaking point. The place where any reasonable woman would look at him and say, this is not what I agreed to, and mean it. Instead, she had told him how to fix it. He blew out the lantern and followed her inside. They made dinner without discussing it. That was what struck him later, turning it over in his mind. There had been no conversation about who would do what. She had simply moved into the kitchen and started. With the efficiency of someone who had fed herself and others for a long time and didn't need direction. And he had come in and found his place in the kitchen without thinking about it, reaching past her for the salt when she needed it. Moving the pot when she gestured, cutting the potatoes because she pointed at them without words, and he understood. They worked in the same kitchen, in the same small space, and did not knock into each other once. He didn't know what to do with that. They ate at the table he'd built himself, rough-hewn and heavy. Built to last rather than to impress. She ate without commenting on the food, which she had made, which meant she was either satisfied or too polite to say otherwise. He ate without tasting it because he was too busy not staring at her and failing. After dinner, she washed the dishes. He brought in wood for morning and came back through to find her standing at the window above the sink, looking out at the dark yard, both hands wrapped around the edge of the counter. I'll sleep in the front room, she said. The settee looks solid. I can take the barn. You'll do no such thing, she turned. Her voice was not sharp, but it was final. This is your house. Mr. Whitaker, I'm a guest until we sort out what we're doing. I'm not chasing you out of it. She paused. The settee is fine. He set the wood down beside the stove. Looked at the floor, looked back up. This wasn't how I meant for things to go, he said. When I wrote to delay, I wasn't trying to why you wrote it. Do you? She looked at him steadily. You were trying to protect me from being disappointed. The slightest pause. You're very practiced at that, aren't you? Protecting people from disappointment before they can ask for something better. The question moved through him like cold water. He didn't answer it directly. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred in 3 places, the hands of someone who had spent years doing the work of 2 people alone. "I've had occasion to practice," he said. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned back to the counter, picked up the dishcloth, began drying her hands. "Well," she said quietly, "I haven't been disappointed today." She folded the cloth and set it down. Not once. She walked out of the kitchen without looking back. Caleb stood at the table in the silence she left behind and did not move for a long time. Outside, the Colorado night had settled in, fully vast and dark and utterly indifferent. The way frontier nights are, with no comfort in them unless you make your own. The kitchen smelled like dinner and wood smoke, and the faint sawdust scent that clung to Evelyn's sleeves from the barn work. He blew out the lamp, walked to his room in the dark, lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling, the solid, undamaged ceiling of his own bedroom, the one room in the house that hadn't needed work, and listened. He was listening for the sound of someone deciding to leave. Old habit. He'd done it for years after his first wife went. Lying still in the dark, waiting for the creak of floorboards, that meant someone was gathering themselves. The careful sounds of a person packing something they didn't want him to hear. What he heard instead was this, the soft shift of weight settling into the front room settee. Then stillness. Just stillness. Another person. Present, not going anywhere. Caleb Whitaker closed his eyes. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, he did not brace himself for morning. She was up before him. He came out of his room to the sound of the stove door. And then the particular creak of the back porch stepped the rotten one. The one that had been on his list for 2 seasons, and then the smell of coffee threading under the door, like something from a different life. He dressed quickly, came out. She was at the stove. Sleeves already rolled, hair not yet fully pinned. One hand wrapped around a half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter beside her. She glanced at him when he appeared. "Sit down," she said. 5 minutes. He sat at his own table in his own kitchen and accepted the coffee she poured without being asked, and thought that he could not remember the last time someone had told him to sit down in his own house, and it had felt like a kindness rather than a command. "The accounts," she said, not turning from the stove. "I noticed the ledger on the shelf last night." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "What about it?" "It looks like it hasn't been touched since spring. I'm better with cattle than numbers. Most ranchers are." She turned from the stove, carrying 2 plates, set one in front of him, sat across from him with her own. "My aunt kept books for her husband's hardware store for 22 years. I learned from her." She picked up her fork. "Let me look at the ledger after breakfast. It's not in good shape. Most ledgers aren't when one person is running everything alone." She looked up at him. "That's not a judgment, it's just what happens." He studied her face across the table. The morning light was direct and unforgiving, and she looked exactly the same as she had on the platform yesterday, clear-eyed. Unhurried, completely herself. "What if you find something bad?" he asked. She held his gaze. "Bad news is better than no news, Mr. Whitaker. At least you know what you're dealing with." She picked up her fork. "Eat." "It's getting cold." He ate. The ledger took most of the morning. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, with the book open between them, working through it from the beginning in silence, making small notes in the margin beside his, in a handwriting that was nothing like his. Small, precise, confident. He answered her questions when she had them. She had several, not accusatory questions, not questions that made him feel foolish, though some of the gaps in the record were the kind that should have made any reasonable bookkeeper flinch. She asked with the neutrality of someone who was gathering information, rather than forming a verdict. And he answered with the honesty he hadn't intended to offer, and couldn't seem to withhold. She reached the bottom of the summer page, sat back, looked at the numbers. "You've got more than you think," she said. He leaned forward. What do you mean, may the cattle sale? She turned the ledger and pointed. You recorded the sale but didn't carry the balance correctly into June. So every calculation you've done from June onward has been working from a figure that's lower than your actual position. She ran her finger down the column. Once I correct this and run the summer numbers forward from the real balance, she looked up. You're not in the trouble you thought you were in. Caleb stared at the numbers. He had spent the entire summer believing he might need to sell the north pasture. He had spent 3 months rationing his worry about it, measuring it out carefully so it didn't swamp him, making contingency plans he didn't want to make, doing the math over and over and getting the same answer. The wrong answer. I thought I was going to have to sell part of the land, he said. You might still choose to, she said it carefully. But not because you have to. Because it might give you capital for the repairs and the fencing while still leaving you healthy going into winter. She paused. There's a difference between a choice and a necessity. He looked at her. Across the kitchen table, in the plain morning light, with his ledger open between them and 3 months of wrong math laid out in her handwriting beside his. You've been here one day, he said. She held his gaze without apology. Yes, and you've told me my ceiling, my lumber. And my accounts are all in better shape than I thought. She considered this. The ceiling still needs a beam replacement, she said. I didn't fix that. Something moved through his chest, an involuntary thing. Unexpected, he pressed his lips together, looked down at the table. Why? He said quietly. Why what? Why did you come? He looked back up. You got the letter. You read it. You knew what you were walking into. He held her gaze. Why did you come anyway? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and the cattle shifted in the pasture. And the house made its small familiar sounds around them. Because your letters told me you were a man who works hard, she said. Who keeps his word? Who was honest enough to warn me when something went wrong instead of letting me arrive and pretending everything was fine? A pause. Do you know how rare that is? He didn't answer. I've met men who promised perfect houses. Her voice was even. Measured. But there was something underneath it, something careful and old, that he recognized without being able to name. I came here for something different. The sentence ended cleanly, with a period, and she turned back to the ledger. He watched her for a moment longer. There was something in what she had said, the particular weight of I've met men who promised perfect houses, that sat uneasily in him. Not because of what she had said, but because of what she hadn't. The way the sentence had been constructed to give him information without giving him everything. The practiced quality of it. She had a history she hadn't told him. He had one too. He picked up his coffee cup and looked out the window and decided. For now, that was all right. Some things took time to earn the right to ask about. 2 more days on the accounts, he said. 2, she confirmed. Not looking up. 3 if you want winter projections. I want them then 3. She picked up her pencil. I'll need you available for questions. I'll be here. She nodded. And went back to work. Bill Harmon arrived on the 4th morning. He was a man of 50, who had built and repaired more structures in this county than anyone else living, and who had his own quiet opinions about most things, including ranchers' wives. He had seen enough of them arrive full of plans and leave full of regrets to have developed skepticism he kept mostly to himself. He pulled up his wagon, climbed down, and walked to the front door. Caleb answered. Bill, come look at the east bedroom. Bill followed him in. He heard her before he saw her, a woman's voice in the hallway, discussing something specific about the ceiling joist angle, using terminology that stopped him in the doorway of the east bedroom. Evelyn Carter was standing in the center of the room, looking up at the canvas, talking to Caleb with her arms slightly raised in that particular gesture people make when they're describing a structural problem they can see clearly in their head. Bill Harmon stood in the doorway and watched. He watched her point to the damaged joint. He watched Caleb listen and respond, and the two of them go back and forth with the easy rhythm of people who had already been thinking through a problem together and were simply continuing. He watched Caleb's face while she was talking. Then he cleared his throat. "You folks know what you want done?" Caleb turned. "Bill. Good, come have a look." Evelyn stepped aside to give him room. Not back, just aside, the way someone moves when they're sharing a working space. Not vacating it. She stayed while Bill assessed the damage. And when he offered his recommendation, she asked 2 questions. Both of them made him stop and revisit something he'd been about to skip. He answered them. "Caleb." "Good woman," he said. Caleb said, "I know." Bill Harmon noted the way Caleb said it without hesitation. Without the slightly self-conscious quality men have when they're complimenting someone they're uncertain about. Just plainly, "I know." Bill looked at Evelyn, who had turned back toward the window with a small, carefully contained expression that he had enough experience with women to recognize. She had not expected that. Whatever walls she had come here with, and Bill Harmon was old enough to know that people who showed up to hard lives usually came equipped with some kind of armor, the 2 words had found a gap in hers. He made note of it and said nothing, and started taking measurements. The ceiling took 5 days. In those 5 days, the accounts were finished and reorganized with winter projections that showed Caleb a clearer picture of the next 6 months than he had possessed in years. The garden fence along the south side was repaired. Evelyn had found the materials in the barn and done it one afternoon while Caleb was moving cattle. And when he came back and saw it, he stood looking at it for a moment without speaking. And then went inside and said nothing about it. And she said nothing about it either. And somehow that was the right thing. The east porch boards, the 3 soft ones, were replaced. Caleb did those himself, but Evelyn was the one who had found the replacement boards in the back of the barn and left them stacked beside the porch without a word. 6 different people came to the ranch on various pretexts. The feed delivery man, the weekly mail carrier, Bill Harmon's apprentice, who was young and talkative and left with more information than he'd probably intended to share. The neighboring rancher, Dixon, who arrived with a transparently false excuse involving a lost fence post and spent 20 minutes in the yard asking questions that were really about Evelyn. Each of them left with impressions that went back to town. Caleb heard the shape of these impressions through Bill Harmon, who was reliable and did not embellish. "They like her," Bill said on the 4th afternoon, driving the last nail into the ceiling frame. "More than they thought they would." "Good," Caleb said. Bill looked at him sideways. Dixon asked her 3 questions about ranch management. She answered all 3 correctly and then asked him one back that he didn't know the answer to. He paused. He liked her most of all. Caleb handed him another nail. "You're not worried," Bill said. It wasn't quite a question. Caleb thought about that. About the fact that he had spent the first 2 days waiting for the moment when the reality of the ranch would overtake whatever idea she had arrived with. He had been tracking it, cataloging her reactions, measuring her expressions, watching for the first sign of second-guessing. He had not found it. "No," he said, "I'm not worried." Bill drove the nail home and said nothing further on the subject. On the 6th evening, without planning it, they ended up on the porch together. The east bedroom repairs had driven them both outside for air. The sawdust and sealant smell thick enough inside that neither of them wanted to sit in it. Evelyn took the south-facing steps, the good ones. Caleb leaned against the porch rail. The sky over the Colorado flatlands went from gold to deep amber to the particular dark blue that comes just before the stars appear. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Bill finishes the ceiling tomorrow," Caleb said. "By noon," he said. "After that, the east bedroom will be usable." A pause. "The settee is fine, Mr. Whitaker." Evelyn. He said her name without the miss for the first time. And she looked up at him. He met her eyes and held them. "You sorted the accounts. You repaired the garden fence. You found the porch boards before I even got to them on the list. You've cooked every meal since you arrived and you've done it, without being asked and without—" He stopped. Exhaled. "I wrote you a letter asking you not to come." "Yes, and you burned it." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I burned the last page. I read the important parts." He almost smiled. "Didn't quite. I'm glad you didn't get it in time." She looked at him for a moment with that steady, level attention of hers. Then she turned back to the darkening horizon. "So am I," she said. The stars began appearing one at a time. Then several at once, then filling the enormous sky over the Colorado plain in the unhurried way they always did, as if they had nowhere to be and all the time there was to get there. Caleb watched them and thought about his first wife. About the particular silence of the months after she left, not the loud kind of quiet that shouts at you, but the low, constant kind that you stop hearing because it becomes the sound of your life. He had stopped expecting that to change. Then a woman from Missouri had burned his letter and boarded a train. He looked at Evelyn's profile in the near dark, the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the stillness she carried, like something she had earned rather than inherited, and thought that there was something in her he had not yet reached the bottom of. Something she had not said and he had not asked. Something behind "I've met men who promised perfect houses" that was waiting in her, the same way the cold waited in the ground here, present and real, and not going anywhere. He would ask her. Not tonight. But he would ask. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "My first wife left," he said it plainly, without dressing it up. 4 years ago. She came out here with plans for what frontier life would be, and she found out the truth of it, and she left. Peaceful, no ugliness. He held Evelyn's gaze. "I told myself the ranch drove her away. The conditions. The isolation. The work." A pause. "I've spent 4 years fixing things, trying to make sure it couldn't happen again." Evelyn was quiet. "I think you know," he said slowly, "that I haven't been fixing the house." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said softly. The wind moved across the flat land. Somewhere in the pasture, a cow called out and went quiet. "I'm not her," Evelyn said. "I didn't come here for what she came for." She turned to face him more fully. "I came here because I had nothing left to go back to. And because your letters told me you were a man who understood that some things are worth the work." Her voice was steady and even, but there was something underneath it, something live and careful. "I'm not planning to leave, Mr. Whitaker." "Caleb," he said. She looked at him. "If we're doing this," he said, "it should be Caleb." Something shifted in her expression, so small he almost missed it. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter and more considered than a smile. "Then I'm not planning to leave, Caleb." He nodded once, turned back to the stars, and for the first time in 4 years, Caleb Whitaker did not spend the evening listening for the sound of someone making plans to go. He sat with the dark and the stars and the cooling Colorado air and the presence of a woman on his porch steps who had burned his letter and come anyway. And he thought that she had a history she hadn't told him, and that he had a history he'd only partially told her, and that somewhere underneath both of those histories was a question neither of them had said out loud yet. He could feel it, the way you feel weather coming, a change in pressure, a stillness before something moves. She felt it too. He was certain of that, but tonight was not the night for it. Tonight they sat in the quiet together, and the quiet was enough. When she finally rose to go inside, she paused at the door. "Caleb." He looked up. "You asked me this morning why I really came." She was a dark shape against the lit doorway, her face half in shadow. "I gave you a true answer." But not the whole answer. He waited. "Someday," she said quietly. "When you're ready to hear it, I'll tell you the rest." She went inside. Caleb sat in the dark for a long time after the door closed. The stars enormous and unhurried overhead, the house solid and lamplit behind him. The whole answer. He turned the words over slowly. He had known there was something, had felt it since the platform, the careful edges of what she offered, the precision with which she had constructed her explanations. Had heard it in I've met men who promised perfect houses and chosen, in that moment, to let it sit. Now it was no longer just a feeling. There was more to Evelyn Carter's story, and she had just told him she knew it and chosen. For now to hold it, he was not afraid of that. But as he rose and walked inside and the night closed over the Colorado plain behind him, the question that followed him down the hall to his room was not what is she hiding. It was simpler than that. It was what happened to her. And underneath that, quieter still, the thing that kept him from sleeping for a long time after he lay down. Whatever it was bad enough that she burned a letter and got on a train and walked into a stranger's broken house rather than stay where she was. He lay still in the dark, and for the first time in 4 years, instead of listening for the sound of someone leaving, he lay awake thinking about a woman who had nowhere to go back to, and wondering what that meant, and knowing somewhere below thought that the answer to that question was going to change everything. The morning after Evelyn's confession on the porch, Caleb woke up and found her gone. Not gone from the ranch. Gone from the settee, gone from the kitchen, gone from anywhere inside the house. Her smaller bag was still on the chair by the front room window. So she hadn't left, but the house was empty, in a way that felt different from the ordinary emptiness of early morning. And it took him a moment of standing in the hallway in his boots to figure out what that difference was. She had been here for 6 days, and for the first time, he couldn't hear her. No movement, no stove, no particular creak of the back step that she always hit exactly upon the same way because she was always in a hurry to get somewhere and didn't watch her feet on the stairs. He went to the back door and opened it. She was in the garden. Not the kitchen garden, the neglected patch on the east side of the yard that had been essentially abandoned for 2 growing seasons, that he walked past every morning without seeing, because it had been on the list so long, it had stopped registering as something that might actually get done. She was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds with both hands. Her sleeves pushed up past her elbows and her hair coming loose from the pins. She hadn't heard the door. He watched her for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to ruin your dress." She didn't look up. "It's already ruined. It got ruined in the barn on the 2nd day. You didn't say anything. It's a dress." She pulled a stubborn weed loose with a grunt of effort. Not a reason to complain. He came off the porch and walked across the yard and crouched down at the edge of the garden bed beside her. The weeds were bad 2 seasons of bad. He could see what she was trying to do and how long it was going to take her. "There are gloves in the barn," he said. "I found them." She held up her hands briefly. "Work gloves 2 sizes too big, already dirty. I borrowed them." He looked at the section she'd already cleared. "She'd been out here for at least an hour. Why didn't you wake me?" he said. She stopped pulling and sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "Because you needed to sleep." A pause. "You don't sleep well." He went still. "I can hear you," she said simply. "Through the wall. You're awake until very late, and you're up before it's properly light and sometimes in between." She stopped. Picked up another weed. "You don't sleep well. I didn't want to wake you." He didn't know what to do with the fact that she had been listening through the wall and had noticed. "I'm fine," he said. "I know you are." She didn't argue it. Didn't push. Just said it like she was filing it somewhere. "Hand me that tool by your knee." He handed it to her. She went back to work. He stayed crouched at the edge of the garden. And after a moment he pulled the 2nd pair of gloves out of his back pocket. He'd grabbed them off the barn hook when he saw where she was and started working beside her. Neither of them mentioned the porch. Neither of them mentioned what she had said, the whole answer she was saving. It sat between them like something with weight, present without being pressed. And the morning went on around it, and the garden gave way slowly under their hands. And by the time the sun was fully up, they had cleared half the east bed, and neither of them had said much of anything. Which was, Caleb had started to understand, one of Evelyn Carter's particular qualities. She did not fill silence because she was uncomfortable with it. She filled it only when she had something to say, and when she didn't, she simply worked, and the working itself became a kind of conversation. And he was getting better at reading it. "There's something I should tell you," he said. She kept working. "All right. About the first wife," her hand slowed. But she didn't stop. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She came from Ohio. She was a good woman. I want to be clear about that. The trouble wasn't her character." He paused. "The trouble was that I didn't know how to let anyone in. Even when she was here, even when she was trying." He looked at his hands in the oversized gloves. "She used to say that living with me was like living beside someone who had boarded up all the windows from the inside. The house was standing, the lights were on, but you couldn't see in. And you couldn't get in, and eventually she got tired of knocking." Evelyn had stopped working. She was listening with her whole body. "I've thought about that a lot," he said. What she said. Whether she was right. He looked up and met Evelyn's eyes across the garden bed. She was right. A beat of quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn asked. "Because last night you told me there was more to your story." He held her gaze. "And I think you need to know that what you tell me when you're ready won't scare me off. And that if you're waiting for me to push you for it." He shook his head slightly. "I won't, but I also won't pretend I didn't hear it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard. Somewhere behind the barn, two of the cattle called to each other and went quiet. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" She almost smiled. "A rancher. Yes." She picked up the tool again. "But that's not all you are." And she went back to work. And he went back to work, and the morning settled around them. And whatever she was holding, whatever whole answer she'd told him, she'd give him someday moved a small degree closer to the surface. He could feel it. He left it alone. 3 days later, the town came to Evelyn, not metaphorically, literally. It came in the form of Margaret Holt, who ran the boarding house in town and who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with a covered dish and an expression of aggressive friendliness that Caleb recognized immediately as the kind worn by women who want information and have constructed an elaborate social reason for coming to get it. He was in the barn when Margaret's wagon arrived. He heard it and came out to find Evelyn already standing on the good porch steps, meeting the woman halfway with a composure that made him slow down and watch from a distance. "You must be Mrs. Whitaker," Margaret said, climbing down with the dish. "Miss Carter," Evelyn said. "We haven't married yet." Margaret absorbed this without visible reaction. "I've brought a welcome pie. Apple. I make it for all the new arrivals." "That's very kind." Evelyn took the dish without a beat of hesitation. "Would you like to come in? I just made coffee." This was the right answer, and they both knew it. And Caleb watched the two women disappear inside and thought that Evelyn had just made either a very good decision or a very complicated one. And he wasn't sure which. He found out at dinner. "She asked about your first wife," Evelyn said. Sitting down across from him, he looked up. Margaret Holt has never had an original thought in her life. Whatever she asked, the town asked. She wanted to know what I knew about her. About why she left. Evelyn unfolded her napkin. "She wanted to know if you'd told me." "What did you say?" "I said you had told me enough." She picked up her fork. "And that I wasn't in the habit of discussing other women's private decisions." He studied her face. "That's a diplomatic answer. It was meant to be." She met his eyes. "She also told me something." Evelyn set her fork down. "She said that when Clara left, she left because of more than the frontier." She said Clara told her a pause. "She said Clara told her that you never once said you loved her." The kitchen went very quiet. Caleb looked at his plate for a long moment. "In 3 years," he said. "Yes." He exhaled through his nose. "Is that what she told people? Is it true?" He was quiet. "Then I thought she knew." "How would she know?" He stopped. Started again. "I built her a better kitchen. I put in a proper cook stove. I fixed the front porch because she mentioned once that it was uneven." He stopped again. "You showed her," Evelyn said quietly. "You didn't tell her." He looked up. Her expression was not unkind. It was not pitying. It was the same steady, direct attention she brought to everything the ledger. The lumber, the garden, seeing clearly without flinching. Caleb, she said his name carefully. Showing someone is important. I believe that. I was raised by a man who showed his love in wood and nails, and I understood it, and I was grateful for it. She paused. But most people need both. He held her gaze, he said. Do you? She picked up her fork again. Or do you know it the same way you knew the accounts were in trouble, aware of the problem? But working from the wrong numbers. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, that's a fair comparison, I thought so. She ate a bite. Calm as ever. I'm not telling you this to reopen old wounds. I'm telling you because she paused, set her fork down. Because I came here with my own version of that problem. Caleb. And I think we should both know what we're working with before it becomes the kind of thing that damages the structure. He was very still. Your version, he said slowly. My version. She folded her hands on the table. I'm very good at doing. I'm very good at fixing and organizing and being useful. I show up and I work and I stay. A pause, and in that pause something moved across her face, something old and tired. What I am not good at is asking for anything in return. The sentence landed quietly but hit hard. He understood, suddenly and completely, what she was telling him. Not the history of it that was still the whole answer she'd promised, and not yet given, but the shape of it. The outline, the thing it had made her into. Someone took advantage of that, he said. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her hands on the table. More than once, she said. The words were small, simple. And they changed everything he thought he knew about why Evelyn Carter had burned a letter from a stranger and boarded a train to Colorado. She hadn't come running toward something. She had come running from something. He opened his mouth to say he wasn't sure what. Something. But she looked up before he could find it, and her expression was back to its baseline steadiness. And he understood that she had offered what she was ready to offer, and the rest would come when it came. The pie Margaret brought is very good, she said. He blinked. The apple pie. She nodded toward the sideboard. She can bake. I'll give her that. A slight pause. Don't read too much into the fact that I noticed. I just appreciate a good pie. And that was that. He let it go, but it stayed with him through the rest of dinner and into the evening and deep into the night when he lay awake in his room. The house quiet around him, listening as he always listened for the sounds of another person present. Safe, not going anywhere, more than once. He turned the words over in the dark like stones. Looking at the undersides. More than once, someone had used Evelyn Carter's capacity for work and giving and staying without giving her anything in return. More than once she had been useful and capable, and present and steady, and had been taken for all of that, without being seen for the person underneath it. And then she had buried her mother alone, and she had burned a letter. And she had gotten on a train. He thought about what it cost a person to do that, to strip everything to a bank and a ticket and a decision, and move toward a life that hadn't even been kind enough to have a finished ceiling waiting for her. What kind of exhaustion that required. What kind of hope. He thought, she trusted me with that. Not all of it. Not yet, but enough, and he thought, don't waste it. The next morning, when she came out of the front room with her hair still loose and her eyes not quite awake, and he was already at the stove because he'd gotten up early. For once deliberately, to do what she always did, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at him. What are you doing? She said. Making breakfast. He didn't look away from the stove. Sit down. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood in the doorway for a moment. And he could feel her, working out what to do with this, with someone doing for her. Unprompted, without being asked, and the small silence of that moment told him more about what she'd been living with than anything she'd said over dinner. Then she sat down. He poured her coffee and set it in front of her and went back to the eggs. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't mention it. He glanced back. She was looking at her coffee cup with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something slightly unguarded. slightly younger than her usual steadiness. Something that looked, very briefly, like it might be relief. "Thank you," she said again. He turned back to the stove. "I heard you the first time." She didn't say anything else. But when he set the plate down in front of her a few minutes later, she looked up at him with that expression still there, and he held her eyes for just a moment, long enough to say what the words between them hadn't quite gotten to yet. Then he sat down and they had breakfast. That afternoon, they had their first real fight. It happened in the yard. Without warning, the way most real fights do, Dixon, the neighboring rancher, had come by again officially to discuss a shared fence line. Actually, to spend 40 minutes, making it clear, through the specific art of Western phone conversations, that he thought Caleb was taking on more than he could handle with a woman who hadn't grown up on a ranch, who didn't know the land, who would find out soon enough what frontier winter actually meant and whether she had the constitution for it. He said none of this directly. He said it in the way men like Dixon said everything sideways, in the form of jokes and observations and questions that were really statements. "Your place is looking different," he said, leaning on the fence post. "She doing all that," meaning the garden, the porch, the organized woodpile. "We both did," Caleb said. Dixon chewed on something. "My second wife was handy, too." "Right up until she wasn't. Your second wife was unhappy from the day she arrived." "That's different." Dixon looked at him, then at the house, then back. "She know what winter's like up here? She's an adult." "Dixon, she can understand what cold means. Cold on paper and cold at 40 below are two different things." "Caleb, I'm aware of that. I know what you're saying." Caleb's voice had gone flat. "I heard it." Dixon raised both hands in the exaggerated peace gesture of a man who has made his point and is satisfied with the damage. "Just being neighborly. Then go be neighborly somewhere else." Dixon left with a grin that meant he'd gotten what he came for, the confirmation that there was something to poke at. That Caleb was defensive about this. That the situation was not as settled as it looked from the outside. Caleb came back inside with his jaw tight and his temper a degree higher than it should have been. And Evelyn took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" "What did he say?" "Nothing worth repeating." She set down the bowl she was holding. "Caleb, he doesn't think you're prepared for what's coming." He said it more sharply than he meant to. He made his opinion clear. "It's his opinion. We don't have to—" "What do you think?" she said. He stopped. "About whether I'm prepared." She held his gaze, and her voice was level, but there was something behind it, something that had been waiting for exactly this question to come from, exactly the direction he hadn't wanted it to come from. "You've been watching me for 10 days. You've seen how I work. What I know and what I don't." She tilted her head. "What do you think, Caleb?" He exhaled. "I think you're more prepared than Clara was." "That's not what I asked." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "I think there are things about this place in winter that you haven't experienced, that no letter or conversation can prepare you for. That's not a judgment on you. It's just the truth." "I know that," she said. "Then why?" "Because I want to know if you believe I can handle them." Her voice was steady, but something in it had gone very direct, very clear. The way her voice got when she was stripping away everything polite and getting to the actual point. "Not whether I've experienced them. Whether you believe I can handle what I haven't experienced yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "You're sure?" "I have been from the day you told me you wanted to inspect the lumber." She held his gaze for a 3 count. Then she picked up the bowl. "Tell Dixon," she said calmly, "that I appreciate his concern." He almost laughed. It came up from somewhere unexpected, and he managed to keep it to a sound rather than a laugh. But it was close. "I'll pass that along," he said. She went back to what she was doing, and the fight, if it had been a fight, was over. But it had changed something in the air between them. Something had been tested and had held, and they both knew it. It was that evening, sitting in the kitchen after dinner. with the account spread between them and a disagreement about the winter feed calculation, simmering at a low productive heat. That the knock came at the front door. Caleb frowned. "Who's calling at this hour?" He went to the door and opened it. The woman standing on the porch was about 40 thin, travel-worn, with a carpetbag at her feet, and an expression that moved through surprise. Calculation, and something else, something complicated, all in the span of about 3 seconds. Caleb had never seen her before in his life. "I'm sorry to arrive without notice," she said. "I'm looking for Evelyn Carter." He felt the words before he processed them. Some instinct, some body-level awareness of wrong moved through him before his mind caught up. "Who are?" he said. "My name is Ruth Dawson." She paused. "I'm Evelyn's sister." There was a sound behind him, a very particular sound. The sharp intake of breath that someone makes when they've been hit by something they did not see coming and could not dodge. He turned. Evelyn was standing in the hallway, very still. Her face a color he hadn't seen on it before, not pale. Something more complicated than pale. Something that was shock, and something older than shock, a mix of emotions that she had not had time to arrange into composure. "Ruth," she said. Her voice was barely above a level sound. "Hello, Evelyn," the woman at the door said. And her voice was careful in a way that told Caleb immediately that there was a history here, and it was not simple, and it had been waiting for this moment for longer than 10 days. Caleb looked from one woman to the other. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. Ruth Dawson picked up her bag and came inside. And Evelyn Carter, who had handled a broken ceiling and a failed ledger and a neighboring rancher's skepticism and a late-night confession on a porch without losing her composure, once stood in the hallway of Caleb's house and looked at her. Sister, with the expression of a woman who was finally, after a very long time, looking at something she had been running from. She was not angry. That was what struck Caleb most. He had expected anger, or at minimum a defensiveness, that he would recognize from his own experience with things from the past arriving unannounced. What he saw on Evelyn's face instead was something more like exhaustion. Like a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long way, and has just seen the place where they are going to have to put it down. "How did you find me?" Evelyn asked. Ruth set her bag by the door. "Your letter. You left a forwarding address with Mrs. Henley before you left. I left that for the post." "Not for I know." Ruth's voice was quiet. "I know that's not what you meant it for." She looked at her sister steadily. "I came anyway," Caleb thought. This is what she ran from. Not one incident. Not one night or one decision. He had been constructing the wrong shape for it in his mind, something singular. Something that happened once and drove her here. What he was looking at in this hallway was something longer than that. Something between two people who had been failing each other for long enough that both of them were tired. "I'll make coffee," he said. Both women looked at him simultaneously, momentarily united in surprise at the practicality of it. He went to the kitchen and made coffee, and he could hear them in the hallway, but not what they were saying. Because they had lowered their voices, which meant they were saying things that needed to be said before the coffee was ready. He took longer with it than he needed to. When he came back with 3 cups, they were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with the particular stiffness of people who have said the first necessary thing and are bracing for the next one. He set the cups down, sat at the end of the table, not between them, but present, visible. Evelyn glanced at him. He looked back at her. Steady and quiet. She seemed to take something from this, because some of the tension in her shoulders settled by a small degree. "Ruth," she said, and her voice had come back to itself, still careful, but clearer. "Tell me why you came." Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. "Because when you left, you didn't say goodbye. You left a note and an address." She stopped. "Evelyn, we're the only family each of us has left. I know that. Then you know that whatever happened between us, or between you," Ruth stopped again, glanced at Caleb. "Made a decision. Whatever happened, you should not have left without saying goodbye." Evelyn looked at her cup. I know. Do you? Ruth's voice had gained an edge. Not cruel, strained. The edge of someone who has been carrying an injury long enough that they are no longer sure whether they are angry or just tired of being hurt. Because for the last 2 months I have been wondering what I did. Evelyn. What I said, what I failed to say. Whether I should have done something differently or said something sooner or, you didn't do anything, Evelyn said. Then why? Because I needed to leave, and if I said goodbye I wouldn't have been able to. Evelyn's voice was very quiet and very final. It wasn't you, Ruth. It wasn't anything you did. I was at the end of something, and I couldn't stand there in that house and say the word goodbye and then change my life. I had to do one or the other. She looked up at her sister. I chose to change my life. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb did not move. Ruth looked at her sister across the table for a long time. There was a great deal in that look, years of it. The compressed and complicated weight of two people who grew up in the same house and became different people and still loved each other in the difficult way that family's love sometimes goes, when it is real and imperfect and undeniable. You should have told me about Thomas, Ruth said. The name fell into the room like a stone into water. Evelyn went very still. Caleb felt the word without understanding it, felt the shape of it. The weight, the way Evelyn's body received it, like something she had been waiting for, and dreading in equal measure. Ruth, she said, and her voice was a warning. He came to me after you left, Ruth said. He had his version of it. I listened to it, because he was there and you weren't. And I didn't know. She stopped. I should have known better. I know I should have. But I need you to tell me the truth of it. Evelyn, I need to hear it from you. Evelyn looked at the table, then back at her sister, and Caleb understood. In that moment, with a clarity that arrived all at once and settled into him with a kind of terrible gentleness, that he was about to hear the whole answer, the one she had promised him someday. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him, and there was a question in her eyes, one she hadn't put there deliberately but couldn't keep out of them. The question of whether this was safe, whether this room, this man, this 10-day-old trust was strong enough to hold what she was about to put in it. He did the only thing he could do. He kept his eyes on hers. And he did not look away. She turned back to her sister, and she began to talk. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table when she started talking. Not folded, not fidgeting, flat the way a person presses their palms down when they need something solid underneath them. Thomas Wren, she said. That's where it starts. Ruth said nothing. She waited. I met him in the spring of 1881, Evelyn continued. He came into Father's shop, looking for finish work on a house he was building outside of town. He was charming. He was educated. He talked about the house like it was going to be something remarkable. She paused. He talked about everything like that. Like every ordinary thing he touched became remarkable by virtue of his touching it. Caleb sat very still at the end of the table. He was not looking at Evelyn with pity. He was looking at her the way she had looked at the damaged ceiling on the first day, directly. Without flinching, because flinching would not help. Father liked him, Evelyn said. That mattered to me. Father was not an easy man to impress, and Thomas impressed him. The finish work was good, and he paid on time, and he came back twice more with additional projects. And by that summer, she stopped. By that summer he was coming back to see me, and we both knew it, and Father knew it, and no one said it out loud because that was how things were done. He proposed in October, Ruth said quietly. Not a question. He proposed in October. Evelyn looked at her sister. And I said yes, I remember, Ruth said. Then you remember that I was happy. Evelyn's voice was even. I want that on record, Ruth. I was genuinely happy. I was not naive about men. Father raised us with too much practicality for that. But Thomas was, he seemed. She pressed her hands harder against the table. He seemed like someone who wanted to build something real. Caleb heard those words and felt them differently than he would have 10 days ago. The house was finished by spring, Evelyn continued. We set the wedding for June. Everything was planned. Everything was arranged. She paused. And then in April, Father died. Ruth made a small sound. It was fast, Evelyn said. 3 weeks from when he first felt ill to when he was gone. And I was not prepared for it, but who is ever prepared for that? I was grieving and exhausted, and she stopped. Thomas was sympathetic. He was present at the funeral. He held my hand. A longer pause. And then 6 days after we buried Father, he came to me and told me that he had been thinking, and that perhaps the timing of the wedding should be reconsidered. Caleb's jaw tightened. He said he was concerned, Evelyn continued, and her voice had taken on a flatness now, the flatness of a story that has been held inside so long it has worn smooth. He said that with Father gone, there were financial considerations that hadn't been part of the original arrangement. That Father's shop would need to be settled, that there were debts he hadn't known about. That the situation was. She stopped again. He used the word complicated. Several times he was backing out, Caleb said. It was the first thing he had said since she started. She looked at him. He was renegotiating. That's how he framed it. Not backing out, renegotiating. The engagement could continue, he said, but the wedding would need to wait until the financial situation was resolved. 12 months, perhaps. That's backing out, Caleb said. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. She looked back at the table. I gave him the ring back, she said. He didn't ask for it. I gave it back because I understood, even through everything I was feeling, that a man who responds to your grief by calculating what your father's death costs him is a man you do not want to marry. She looked at Ruth. I know you didn't understand that at the time. I know you thought I was being proud and impulsive, and that I should have waited and let him come back around. Ruth looked at her hands. I didn't know what he'd said to you. He told me it was mutual. That you'd both agreed to wait. I know. Evelyn's voice did not carry blame. It carried something more exhausted than blame. He was very good at the version of things he told other people. He came back, Ruth said quietly. 6 months later. He came back, Evelyn confirmed. He came back with flowers and an explanation and a new timeline and something that sounded, if you listen to the words rather than the history, like genuine remorse. She was quiet for a moment. And I was alone, and the shop was struggling, and I was 31 years old and I was alone. Ruth, do you understand what I mean when I say that? Not lonely. There is a difference. Ruth's eyes were wet. She didn't speak. I took him back, Evelyn said flatly. I took him back because I was tired and because I thought I had been too harsh, and because he seemed different. He seemed like a man who had made a mistake and understood it. She paused. He was not different. He was more careful. That is not the same thing. Caleb had stopped breathing normally. He was very carefully breathing normally. He never proposed again, Evelyn said. He didn't need to. I had come back to him, which meant he had what he wanted without having to give anything more than he'd already given. She searched for the word. We were understood to be together. By the town, by Ruth, by everyone. And I worked the shop and I managed the accounts and I was useful and I was capable, and he came by twice a week and took dinner, and occasionally said something kind, and her voice stopped. Evelyn, Ruth said. 3 years, Ruth. Evelyn looked at her sister and the exhaustion in her face was complete and specific and old. 3 years of that. Of being grateful for the twice a week. Of telling myself it was enough, that things would change, and that this was what available love looked like when you were 31 and alone and not Clara Morrison with her father's cattle money. She paused. And then Mother got sick. The kitchen was absolutely silent. And Thomas became very busy, Evelyn said. He had projects. He had obligations. He came to the house twice during the 8 months Mother was dying. Twice. He brought flowers the first time. She said the word flowers with a precision that made it sound like what it was. And when Mother died and I was standing at that graveside alone, I looked to my left and my right, and there was no one there who was not paid to be there. And I thought. She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table again. I thought if I stay here I will spend the rest of my life being useful and capable and grateful and alone. And I thought, I have done nothing to deserve this. And I thought, she exhaled. I thought, I am going to burn the next letter that tries to talk me out of leaving. The silence that followed was the longest Caleb had ever sat inside. Ruth was crying quietly. Not loudly. Ruth did not seem like a woman who cried loudly. She was doing it the way people cry when they have been holding something for a very long time, and something has finally, carefully opened it. Evelyn looked at her sister, and her own eyes were bright, but her jaw was set. I am not telling you this so you will feel badly, Evelyn said. I am telling you because you came all this way and you asked, and you are the only family I have left, and I am done keeping it arranged into a shape that is easier for other people to look at. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over Evelyn's. Evelyn looked at their hands. Then she turned hers over and held on. I should have known, Ruth said. I should have seen it. You saw what he wanted you to see. I should have looked harder. Ruth pressed her fingers around her sister's hand. I'm sorry, nodded once. And then she was quiet. And the two of them sat like that, hands joined across the kitchen table, in the specific exhausted way of people who have finally said something true after years of circling it. Caleb looked at the window. He was turning over everything he had just heard and measuring it against the 10 days he had already spent with this woman. And what he was finding was that nothing changed. Not the lumber. Not the ledger. Not the garden or the breakfast or the porch in the dark. None of it changed. It only made more sense. It only told him what he had already started to understand, that Evelyn Carter was not here because she had run out of options. She was here because she had finally, after too many years of waiting, made a choice that was entirely her own. He pushed back his chair and stood up. Both women looked at him. Ruth, he said, you'll stay tonight. There's a room, the ceiling is finished now. He looked at Evelyn. I'll bring her bag up. He picked up Ruth's carpet bag from by the door before either of them could respond. And he carried it down the hallway to the east bedroom, the room with the new ceiling. Bill Harmon's 5 days of work overhead, solid and complete, and he set it at the foot of the bed and stood there for a moment, in the room that had been a canvas and a problem, and was now simply a room. Then he went to the barn. He did not go because anything needed doing in the barn. He went because Evelyn and her sister needed the house to themselves for a while. And because he needed somewhere to put the thing that was moving through his chest. And the barn was the place he had always gone when he needed to think without anyone watching. He stood in the dark of it for a long time. He thought about Thomas Wren. He thought about what it meant to be a person who showed up to someone's grief and calculated the cost. He thought about 3 years of twice a week and flowers, and Evelyn standing alone at a graveside in Missouri and looking left and right and finding no one. He thought about the letter she had burned. He thought about how it must have felt to stand over that candle and watch the paper catch the specific relief of it. The terror of it, the extraordinary act of deciding that being alone was better than this particular version of not alone. He pressed both hands against the top of the workbench and looked at the wood grain. Then he heard the barn door. He turned. Evelyn was standing in the doorway. She had a lantern. She held it up slightly and found him in the dark and came in without asking if it was all right. She's asleep, she said. She was more tired than she admitted. Long trip, he said. Yes, she set the lantern on the workbench, stood beside him. Was quiet for a moment. You left. I know why you left. She turned and looked at him directly. I'm not accusing you, I'm saying I noticed. A pause. And that I'm glad you did it. And also that she stopped. Started again. I don't need you to leave the room. Caleb. Whatever I have to say, whatever you hear in this house, you don't need to remove yourself from it to protect me. He looked at her. You can stay in the room, she said. I want you in the room. The words were simple. She said them simply. But they landed in him the way simple and true things always land when you have been waiting for them without knowing it. All right, he said. All right. She turned to face the workbench beside him. Was quiet again. Then are you going to ask me about Thomas? No. She looked at him sideways. You told me what I needed to know, he said. The rest is yours. She was quiet for a moment. Most men would want the details. I'm not interested in the details, he met her eyes. I'm interested in you, what you want, what you need. What you're going to do with the rest of your life, now that you've made it this far. He paused. Thomas Wren is not relevant to that. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she said, he's coming here. The barn went very quiet. What? Caleb said. Ruth told me tonight before she went to sleep. She told me Evelyn's jaw was set, but her hands had closed around the edge of the workbench. He came to Ruth after I left. He told her his version. Like she said. But Ruth also told me that he has been asking around about where I went. That someone she doesn't know who told him about the advertisement. About Colorado, she stopped. Ruth came to warn me. That's why she came. Caleb said nothing for a moment. How much time, he said. Ruth doesn't know. She came as fast as she could. Which means Evelyn exhaled. Not much. What does he want? Ruth thinks he wants me to come back. Her voice was even. He has decided that my leaving was an overreaction, and that with some conversation she stopped. Her jaw worked. He has never once in his life believed that the word no from a woman meant anything except a temporary position. Caleb turned to face her fully. Listen to me, he said. She looked at him. This is your life, he said. What you want to happen, that is what happens. You understand me? If you want him turned away at the road, I will turn him away at the road. If you want to speak to him yourself, I will be beside you while you do. If you want, held or gaze. Whatever you want. But I need to know what that is. Evelyn looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the steady calm of the ledger work or the focused practicality of the lumber. Something rawer than that. Something that was trying to stay steady and was not quite managing it. I don't know what I want yet, she said honestly. That's all right. It's not a weakness, she said. And there was a slight edge in it, a defensiveness, that told him someone had made her feel that not knowing was a failure. I know it's not, he said. Take the time you need. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned back to the workbench and stood there in the lantern light. And he stood beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while. Can I tell you something? She said. Yes. She stopped. I've been waiting for you to show me who you really are. Under the politeness, under the practical. She stopped again. In my experience, what people show you in the first 2 weeks is the version. The actual person shows up later, usually when something goes wrong, he said. And tonight something went wrong. She looked at him. And you picked up her bag. He did not entirely understand what she meant at first. Then he did. She had been watching for his reaction to difficulty specifically. To her difficulty, her complicated history arriving in a carpet bag at his front door without warning, and his reaction had been to pick up the bag and find the woman a room. That's a low bar, he said. You'd be surprised, she said quietly. How few men clear it. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And in the lantern light her face was open, in a way it hadn't quite been before the guard not gone. But lowered, the careful arrangement of herself slightly loosened. Like a door that has been closed and bolted for a long time. Which has not opened but has come unlocked. Evelyn, he said. Don't, she said. I haven't said anything. You're about to say something careful and good, and I am not ready for it tonight. She said it without unkindness. Give me a day or two. Let things settle. She picked up the lantern. Then say whatever you were going to say. He almost smiled. All right, good night, Caleb. Good night. She walked out of the barn. The lantern light going with her, and he stood in the dark for a moment. And then he followed her back to the house. Ruth Dawson stayed 4 days. It was enough time for Caleb to understand her, and for her to understand him. And for the two sisters to do whatever the work is that sisters do when they have spent years failing each other gently and have decided, finally, to be honest about it. He did not hear most of those conversations. He did not try to. He gave them the kitchen in the mornings and the front room in the evenings, and made himself scarce in the ways that were practical without being absent. And Ruth watched him do this with the particular attention of a woman who is reassessing something she had already judged. On the third day, she came to find him in the barn. He heard her step and turned. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Caleb," he said. She came in and stood in a way that told him she had something prepared. "I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. What are your intentions toward my sister?" He looked at her. She was not asking it the way a protective relative asks it as a challenge, as a test. She was asking it the way someone asks a question they genuinely do not know the answer to and have decided that directness is the only way to get one. "To give her a home," he said, "if she wants it." He paused. "To give her a situation where being capable and useful is something she does because she wants to. Not because it's the price of staying." He met Ruth's eyes. "And to be the kind of man who is in the room when things are difficult." Ruth looked at him for a long time. "She told you about Thomas," she said. "She did. Then you know she doesn't trust easily, I know, and that she will work herself into the ground before she asks for help. I've noticed." Ruth exhaled. "She's been taking care of people since she was 12 years old. Father, then mother, then she stopped. She doesn't know how to be taken care of. It frightens her, I think, more than she would ever say." He nodded slowly. "I know that too." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She watched you from the kitchen window last night, when you were checking the fence line after dinner. She stood there for 5 minutes, and she didn't know I could see her." He said nothing. She looked. Ruth searched for the word. She looked like someone who is very carefully deciding whether to believe in something. She paused. "Don't give her a reason not to." "I don't intend to," he said. Ruth nodded once, and then she turned and went back toward the house. And he went back to work, and something between him and the woman he was going to marry, because he had understood somewhere in the last 4 days that that was what was happening. Even if neither of them had said it, yet had been quietly confirmed by a third party who loved her and had come all this way to check. On the morning of the 4th day, Ruth's wagon came to take her to the station. The sisters stood in the yard and spoke in low voices for a long time, and Caleb stayed at the porch and did not watch. When Ruth came to shake his hand, she held it a moment longer than necessary. "Thomas Wren," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "He was last heard from in Kansas City." "That was 10 days ago." "Thank you." She nodded. Let go of his hand. Climbed up to the wagon. He watched the wagon go, and then he looked at Evelyn, who was looking at the road where her sister had been. "She'll write," he said. "Yes." Turned toward the house. "She will." She paused on the step, looked back at him. "She likes you. She told me." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "When?" "Yesterday. In the barn." She looked at him with the expression she wore when he had surprised her, which was becoming one of his favorite things about her. Because Evelyn Carter was not easily surprised, and when she was it showed in this specific and unguarded way that was completely unlike her usual composure. "What did she say?" Evelyn asked. "That you were watching me from the kitchen window." Evelyn's expression went through 3 things very fast. Then she turned and went inside. He followed her, not quite hiding the fact that he was smiling. They had 2 days of ordinary. Ordinary was its own thing. By then, 2 people who had found their rhythm in a house that was more finished than it had been, and a ranch that was running better than it had in years, and an accounting situation that no longer kept Caleb awake at night the way it had all summer. 2 days of work and meals, and the particular comfortable friction of 2 people who had stopped being careful with each other in the way you are careful with strangers, and had started being honest in the way you are honest with someone you have decided to trust. On the evening of the 2nd day, he told her about Clara. The rest of it, not just the boarded-up windows, the specific, detailed account of a marriage that had failed quietly and without cruelty, and what it had done to him, and the 4 years of listening in the dark afterward. and the advertisement he had almost not placed because he was not sure he deserved to ask someone to come here. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You placed the ad. That was brave," she said. "For someone with your history, that was a brave thing to do." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "I don't know if it was brave or desperate. Sometimes those are the same thing." She met his eyes. "I burned a letter and got on a train. Was that brave or desperate?" "Both," he said. "Both," she agreed. They sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Caleb, I want to say something and I need you to let me finish it." "All right, I am not Clara," she said it firmly. Without drama. "I am not going to decide in 6 months or a year that this is too hard. I am not going to make you rebuild every room of your trust from scratch every time something is difficult." She paused. "But I also need you to understand that there is a version of me that will disappear if she is not careful. The version that works and works and works and never says what she needs and waits to be noticed." She held his gaze. "I have been that version before. I know how to be her. And I am asking you to help me not be her again." He was very quiet for a moment. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I will." She paused. "That is the most honest answer I can give you right now." "I will try." "Enough," he said. "And you," she said. "Open a window, Caleb. At least one. I'm not asking for all of them. Just occasionally let someone see in." He looked at the table. "I'm trying," he said. "I know you are." Her voice was gentle. "I noticed." He looked up at her. She looked back at him with the door unlocked, not open, but unlocked, and they were both in the kitchen of his house in the Colorado dark. And the ceiling was fixed, and the accounts were straight, and the fence was holding, and neither of them had said the word yet. But they were both in the room. And then on a Thursday afternoon, when the light was going gold and long and Caleb was in the south pasture checking on a fence post that Dixon had flagged, Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard. She looked out the window. The man on the horse was not someone she recognized from town. He was well dressed for the road, sitting straight, with the particular posture of a man who has always believed that how he appears in public is something worth managing. He looked at the house, and Evelyn looked at him, and she knew, before she had time to think it through or brace for it or decide anything at all, exactly who was sitting on that horse in Caleb Whitaker's yard on a Thursday afternoon in Colorado. Her hands were flat on the kitchen counter. He had found her. Thomas Wren had found her. She stood very still for exactly 5 seconds. Then she took her hands off the counter, and she walked to the back door, and she opened it, and she went out onto the porch, and she looked at him directly. He saw her. His expression moved a quick, complicated sequence she knew well. Relief, confidence, the beginnings of the smile he used when he wanted to seem like the reasonable one. "Evelyn," he said. She stood on the porch of Caleb Whitaker's house with both feet square on the boards and looked at Thomas Wren. And she thought about burned letters and train tickets and canvas ceilings, and ledgers corrected, and garden beds cleared, and a man who had picked up her sister's bag without being asked and stood in a barn, in the dark, and told her she could stay in the room. "Thomas," she said, her voice was steady, "you need to leave." He didn't move. He tilted his head with the expression she used to read as patience, and now recognized as calculation. "I've come a long way, Evelyn. I know. I think we should talk. There is nothing to talk about." "Evelyn." The smile again. The reasonable voice. The particular tone that had worked on her for 3 years because she had been alone and tired and willing to hear what she wanted to hear. "You've made your point. I understand that. But you left without giving us the chance to." "I left," she said, "because there was no us. There hasn't been for a long time." She held his gaze and her voice did not shake. "I left because I stood at my mother's grave alone and understood something that I should have understood much sooner. And I came here and I built something, and you are not welcome in it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze went to the house, to the repaired roof and the straight fence and the evidence of a place that was being lived in and tended. "You married him," he said. It was almost an accusation. "Not yet," she said. Something shifted in Thomas Wren's expression. The reasonable tone went somewhere slightly colder. "You don't know this man. I know him better in 10 than I knew you in 5 years." She stepped down off the porch one step. "Because he has never once given me a reason not to." Thomas's jaw tightened. And then a sound, the sound of a horse coming up the far side of the yard. The soft thud of boots landing on ground, and Caleb Whitaker came around the corner of the barn and stopped. He took in the scene in about 2 seconds. He looked at Thomas Wren on the horse. He looked at Evelyn on the porch steps. He looked at the set of her shoulders. Her feet square, her chin level. He looked at Thomas Wren again. And then he walked across the yard and stood beside Evelyn on the porch steps and said nothing at all. He did not say, "Get off my property." He did not reach for anything or raise his voice or perform any of the things that men perform when they want to establish something through threat. He simply stood beside her. Thomas Wren looked at the two of them for a long moment. Whatever he had expected to find in Colorado, whatever version of a woman waiting to be retrieved, he had ridden all this way toward what he was looking at was not it. He was looking at a woman standing on a porch in front of a repaired house that she had had some part in repairing, next to a man who had not said a word and did not need to. The silence was its own answer. Thomas's horse shifted under him. "This isn't finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Evelyn said. He looked at her one more time, then at Caleb. Then he turned his horse and rode out of the yard. And the sound of hoofbeats faded into the flat afternoon. And the quiet came back in around them, the way quiet does when something has been resolved that was a long time in the resolving. Evelyn did not move for a moment. Then she exhaled a long, slow breath that carried years in it. Caleb put his hand over hers on the porch railing. She looked down at their hands. Then she looked at him. And her eyes were bright, and her jaw was still set. And she was the most completely herself she had ever looked to him, all of it present at once. The strength and the tiredness and the relief and the thing underneath, everything that was not quite ready yet to be named, but was unmistakably there. "He'll go," Caleb said quietly. "I know," she said. "You were paused. You handled that." "We handled it," she said. He looked at her. She looked at their hands on the railing. "You stood beside me," she said. That was everything." Caleb. He kept his hand over hers and said nothing. Because nothing needed to be said, and they stood there together on the porch of the house that was more finished than it had been, and less finished than it would be. In the Colorado afternoon that was going gold around them. And something that had been building since a train platform to Sagas reached a place where it could rest. Not finished, but held. Thomas Wren did not go. That was the first thing Caleb learned the next morning. When Bill Harmon pulled his wagon into the yard at 7 and climbed down with the particular expression of a man who is carrying news he did not ask to carry. "He's at Mrs. Holt's boarding house," Bill said without preamble. "Checked in last night. Told Margaret he was in town on business." Bill paused. Margaret told him she didn't know anything about any business that would bring a Missouri man to this county. He told her he had personal matters to attend to. Caleb looked at Bill for a moment. Then he looked at the house. Evelyn was inside. She had not yet come out. "How long?" Caleb said. "Margaret doesn't know. He paid for a week." "A week." Caleb absorbed that. Thomas Wren had ridden away from this yard yesterday afternoon with the look of a man who had lost a conversation, and he had ridden directly to the nearest boarding house and paid for a week. That was not a man who had accepted no. "Thank you," Caleb said. Bill nodded, started to turn, then stopped. He asked Margaret about the ranch. "About you. About how long the woman had been here and what the arrangement was." He paused. "Margaret told him exactly nothing useful, and I want you to know she was pleased about that. Tell her I appreciate it." Bill climbed back on his wagon and left, and Caleb stood in the yard with this information and thought about what to do with it. He decided to tell Evelyn immediately, not because she couldn't handle it. Because she had asked him to stay in the room and This was what staying in the room meant: not managing things quietly on her behalf. Not deciding what she needed to know and what she didn't. She had spent 5 years with a man who managed her by controlling what she knew and how she knew it. He was not going to be that. He went inside and found her in the kitchen and told her directly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down the cup she was holding. "A week," she said. "That's what Bill said." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking, not panicking, not falling apart, but genuinely thinking, the way she thought through the lumber and the ledger, looking at the actual shape of the problem. "He wants me to come to him," she said. "That's what the week is. He's waiting for me to come into town and have the conversation he thinks he's owed." She looked at Caleb. He's never had to chase anything. Things have always come to him when he waited long enough. "What do you want to do?" "I want him to leave." She said it simply. But wanting that and making it happen are different things. "And I know Thomas well enough to know that he is not going to leave because I told him to leave." She paused. "He needs to believe it's his own decision." Caleb looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means stopped. Thought. It means I need to go into town, not to meet him. Not to have his conversation." Her voice was firm. "I need to be seen, living my life, going about my day. Not hiding here because he's at the boarding house." She met Caleb's eyes. "If I stay on this ranch and don't go into town for a week, he will tell himself and he will tell anyone who asks that he has unsettled me. That there is unfinished business, that I am uncertain." She shook her head. "I am not uncertain, and I will not let him create that story." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I'd like you to come with me." "I was going to," he said. She held his gaze for a beat. Then she picked up her cup again. "We'll go this afternoon. I need to speak with Mrs. Henderson at the dry goods store anyway. We're low on preserving supplies and the root cellar won't fill itself." And just like that, she had folded Thomas Wren's presence in town into an errand. Made it practical. Refused to give it more weight than it deserved. Caleb thought that was one of the bravest things he had ever seen a person do. They went into town that afternoon. The main street of Millhaven was the kind of street that noted things. It was small enough that a new face registered, and large enough that there were always people moving through it. And the combination meant that news traveled at a specific speed that was neither slow nor hysterical, but consistently thorough. Evelyn walked beside Caleb with her chin level and her step unhurried. And she spoke to Mrs. Henderson about preserving jars for 11 minutes, and to the blacksmith's wife about a church event she had heard about through Margaret Holt. And she did all of this with a composure that was not performance. Caleb had been around her long enough now to know the difference between Evelyn performing and Evelyn simply being. It was just who she was when she was unafraid. He stayed beside her, not in front of her, not slightly behind. Beside. They were coming out of the feed store when Thomas appeared. He came from the direction of the boarding house, on foot. And the moment he saw them, he altered his path slightly, with the practiced casualness of a man who wants to appear as though the encounter is coincidence. Caleb felt Evelyn's step hesitate for exactly one beat. Then she continued walking. Thomas fell into their path anyway. He was unavoidable without being rude about it, which was something he had always been skilled at, creating situations where the only way to avoid him required more effort than engaging with him. "Evelyn," he said. His eyes moved to Caleb briefly. Then back to her. "I was hoping to run into you, Thomas." Her voice was level. "I believe I made my position clear yesterday. I think there are things we should discuss privately." His voice was the reasonable one. The patient one. The one that had worked for years because she had trained herself to hear it as kindness. "For both our sakes." "There is nothing for both our sakes," she said. "There is nothing that requires privacy. Everything I have to say to you, I can say." "Caleb, I'd rather not." "He stays," Evelyn said. Something moved through Thomas's expression, not anger. "Exactly. The tightening of a man who is losing control of a situation he came here believing he could control. Evelyn. He lowered his voice. I made mistakes, I understand that. I came here because I want to make them right. After everything we had, what we had, she said, was 5 years of me waiting for you to decide I was worth the effort. And the answer was consistently no. She was not loud. She was not shaking. She was the clearest version of herself that Caleb had seen. I am not angry at you, Thomas. I want you to understand that. I'm not standing here with grievances. I'm standing here with a life I've started, and I am asking you, for the last time, to let me have it. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Caleb, and something in them shifted some calculation that Caleb recognized as the moment when a man stops looking at a situation and starts looking for a weakness. How long have you known this man? Thomas said. Long enough, Evelyn said. 2 weeks, Thomas said. 3, you don't know him. Evelyn, you responded to an advertisement from a stranger and you traveled across. I know what I did, she said. You were grieving. You were alone. You made a decision under circumstances that weren't. Thomas. Her voice was quiet, but it cut clean through everything he was building. I am going to say this once. I was not confused. I was not impulsive. I was not operating from grief, though grief was present. She paused. I was finally, for the first time in years, operating from clarity. She held his gaze. And what I saw clearly was what I did not want, which was more of what you were offering. The street had gone very quiet around them. Several people who had been going about their own business were no longer precisely doing that. Old Pete Larson, who seemed to materialize wherever something interesting was happening, was outside the barber shop. Margaret Holt had appeared in the doorway of her boarding house down the street. Thomas Wren looked at Evelyn and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the woman he had come here to retrieve had been replaced by something. She had always been underneath something he had never been interested enough to look for. You're making a mistake, he said. I don't think so, she said. He looked at Caleb one more time, the look of a man measuring something and not liking the measurement. Then he looked back at Evelyn. You'll write to me when this— No, she said. I won't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the specific nod of a man who is choosing to frame his departure as a decision rather than a defeat, and he turned and walked back toward the boarding house. Evelyn watched him go. Caleb watched her watch him. When Thomas disappeared inside, she exhaled not the long exhausted breath of the porch yesterday, but something shorter and more complete. Like a door closing on a sound that had been too loud for too long. He'll leave tomorrow, she said. How do you know? Because he got what he came for. She turned to look at Caleb. He came to see if I was certain. Now he knows I am. She paused. Thomas doesn't waste effort on certainty. Only on uncertainty. Caleb looked at her. You understood him very well. I had to. She picked up the supply bag she'd set down at the start of the encounter. It was the only protection I had for a long time. They walked back to the wagon together, and the street watched them go, with the specific attention of a small town that has just witnessed something it will discuss for several weeks. And neither Caleb nor Evelyn looked back. Thomas Wren checked out of Mrs. Holt's boarding house the following morning and was not seen in Millhaven again. Margaret Holt reported this to Bill Harmon, who reported it to Caleb, who told Evelyn over breakfast. She nodded once. Good, she said. And then she asked him to pass the butter, and that was the last time Thomas Wren was discussed at the Whitaker Ranch for a very long time. What followed was October. Colorado October was its own education. And Caleb had known it would be, had been waiting, with a quiet and not entirely conscious tension, for the moment when the reality of it met Evelyn's expectations of it, and he found out what the gap looked like. Dixon's voice had been in the back of his head more than he wanted to admit. Cold on paper and cold at 40 below are two different things. He needn't have worried. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday night, and Evelyn was up before it properly arrived, because she had been watching the sky the way her father had taught her to watch it. and she had understood what was coming before Caleb's body clock told him to move. He woke to the sound of her in the kitchen and came out to find the stove stoked and the water pots on, and a systematic organization of the root cellar in progress. Because she had gone down there in the early dark and taken stock and determined what needed to come up before the ground made access difficult. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Missouri winters aren't Colorado winters," she said. "Not stopping, but cold is cold. You prepare or you suffer." She handed him a list. "The North Fence bill told me last week there's a post leaning. If it goes in a freeze, the cattle will drift." He looked at the list. She had written it in the dark, apparently, because it was in the slightly larger handwriting she used when she couldn't see well. "I'll go now," he said. "Take the heavier coat." "The one in the back of the wardrobe." He stopped. "How do you know which coat?" "I found it when I reorganized the wardrobe," she said. 2 weeks ago. She looked at him briefly. "It's the warmest one." "Wear it." He wore it. The fence post was indeed leaning badly enough that he spent an hour resetting it in the iron-hard ground before the frost could finish the work. He came back with his hands raw and found lunch on the table, and Evelyn sitting across from him with the winter accounts open. "We have enough for heating through March," she said. Without looking up, "If it runs long, we'll need to order more before February." "I've made a note." He sat down, picked up his fork. "You've been busy. There's a lot to do before winter sets in properly." She turned a page. "I want to talk to you about the cattle rotation." The rotation is fine for the current herd size. But I've been looking at the land usage, and I think there's a section of the east pasture that isn't being used efficiently. If we looked up at him. "You're smiling." "I'm not. You are. You have the particular expression you make when you're trying not to smile." "I wasn't aware I had a particular expression." "You have several." She looked back at the accounts. "You have the one you make when Bill says something obvious that you already knew. You have the one you make when Dixon says something you disagree with and you decide not to argue. And you have the one you make when I say something that surprises you in a way you find." She paused, searching for the word agreeable. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you call it?" he said. "I call it what I observe." She turned another page. But there was something at the corner of her mouth that had not been there a moment ago. He ate his lunch and watched her work and thought that he had lived in this house for 11 years and had never once, in all that time, understood how empty it was until it wasn't. It was 2 weeks into October when the letter arrived. Not from Ruth. Not from Thomas. Evelyn had been right about Thomas. He was gone, and he stayed gone, and whatever residual presence he had carried in Evelyn's posture and careful edges had been diminishing steadily in the weeks since the street in Millhaven. The letter was from the bank in Denver. Caleb read it twice at the kitchen table before he understood it fully. And then he sat with it for 10 minutes before he heard Evelyn come in from the garden. And he made the decision that he had learned to make. He did not manage this quietly. He did not wait until he had a solution to present alongside the problem. He told her. "The bank is calling in part of the note," he said when she came through the door. She stopped. "Read his face," he told her. She sat down across from him, and he slid the letter across the table, and she read it. And he watched her read it, with the same focused attention she brought to everything. And when she finished, she set it down and was quiet for a moment. "This is the Halverson decision," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "I saw the notation in the accounts from 2 years ago. Halverson defaulted on a shared grazing agreement with the bank, and you were listed as secondary security." She looked up at him. "The bank absorbed Halverson's loss, and they've been waiting to recover it. The note coming due now is them recovering it from you." He stared at her. "I forgot about that. I know. It was buried in the summer records from 2 years ago, and your dating was..." She paused. "Incomplete." He ran a hand through his hair. "We don't have that liquidity right now." No, she was already thinking he could see it. "But we have the North Pasture section." He looked at her. You said yourself you'd been considering selling it, she said. Not because you had to, because it might give you capital. She held his gaze. Now you have a reason to time the decision. That land belonged to my father. The words came out quieter than he intended. And she heard what was under them immediately, not argument. Not resistance, just the specific weight of a thing that is more than a thing. She was quiet for a moment. Tell me about it, she said. He looked at the letter, then at her. Then he told her about his father. About the land, about the particular section of the north pasture that his father had fenced himself in the summer of 1869 and had told Caleb the summer before he died was the best piece of ground on the property because of the way the creek curved along the western edge and kept it green when everything else went dry. Evelyn listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "Is there another way? I've been trying to think of one since I read the letter." "Think out loud," she said. "I'll think with you." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Evelyn pulled out the accounts and went through them with the focused precision of someone who is looking for something they believe is there. And Caleb talked through the options he could see and the ones he was less sure about. And between them slowly, in the way that two people build something neither of them could build alone, they found a third way. Not the north pasture, not the full bank demand met immediately. A partial payment from the operating account that Evelyn had found room in by restructuring the winter spending plan, combined with a timber sale from the South Ridge that Caleb had been putting off for 3 years because the coordination required more time than he'd had when he was managing everything alone. The timber sale, Evelyn said. How long to arrange? 6 weeks if I start immediately. That's before the bank's deadline. Yes. She looked at the numbers. It works. Barely. Barely is enough. She looked up at him. Barely is what we have. We use it. He looked at the plan laid out across the table, her handwriting and the accounts and the projections and the calculations that said, if everything held, the north pasture stayed, his father's fence line, the creek curve that kept things green when everything else went dry. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. She shook her head slightly. This is what partners do. The word sat between them on the table alongside everything else. Partners. She had said it practically in the context of accounts and timber sales and banknotes, but it landed differently than practically. It landed the way a word lands, when it is the right word, for something that has been looking for its name for a while. He looked at her across the table. She was looking at the accounts, but her pen had stopped moving. Evelyn, he said. Caleb. She didn't look up. Say what you're going to say. I've been trying to find the right time. There isn't one. She looked up. There's just the time you choose. He held her gaze. I would like to marry you, he said. Not will you. Not the formal construction of a question he was afraid she might answer wrong. Just the plain statement of what he wanted and what he was asking. I would like to do this properly. I would like you to have the name and the standing, and I would like you to be here officially. Not because of the bank or the ranch or anything practical. He paused. Because you are the best thing that has happened in this house in a very long time, and I don't want you to have any doubt about whether you're meant to be in it. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. You practiced that, she said. Twice, he admitted. In the barn. Something moved through her expression, the door. This time, not just unlocked but opening. I noticed you were in the barn a long time yesterday. I was also checking the latch on the south gate. Of course you were. She looked at him steadily. Yes, Caleb, he went very still. Yes, she said it simply. Like everything she said, without performance, without excess. With the complete and direct honesty, that was the most fundamental thing about her. I came here to build something real. I would like to build it with you. She paused. Officially. She smiled, a real one. Not the small contained version she used when she was being careful. A full and genuine and completely unguarded smile that rearranged everything in her face and made her look. For just a moment, like someone who had set down something very heavy and discovered that her arms still worked. He smiled back. Then she picked up her pen and looked back at the accounts. Now, the timber sale. You said 6 weeks. Who do you contact first? He laughed. It came out of him before he could catch it, a real laugh. Unplanned, from somewhere he hadn't accessed in a long time, and she looked up at him with that unguarded expression still on her face. And in the kitchen of the house that was more finished than it had been, and less finished than it would become. Something settled into its right place with a solidity that felt like it had always been meant to be there. The Hendersons in Durango, he said when he could. They've been interested in the South Ridge timber for 2 years. Write to them today, she said. Today, he agreed. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Evelyn organized the winter cellar. They had dinner as the dark came in around the house. And afterward they sat together in the front room, not at the kitchen table. Not on separate chairs, but on the settee where she had slept her first nights in the house. Side by side, with the accounts on the low table in front of them and the fire going in the stove. She fell asleep before 9 o'clock. He knew, because her breathing changed and her head dropped slightly and the pen she'd been holding went still. He looked at her, the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been running on determination for a very long time and had finally found somewhere safe enough to let it rest, and he carefully took the pen from her hand and set it down. She didn't wake. He sat beside her in the quiet house and thought about the timber sale and the bank and the north pasture still holding. And he thought about the word partners and the word yes, and the smile that had rearranged her face. And he thought about a woman who had burned a letter and boarded a train and walked into an unfinished house and rebuilt from the inside without ever once asking for recognition. He thought, she came here to build something real. And then, with a quietness that was not uncertainty, but a specific stillness of a man who has found solid ground, after a long time on uncertain terrain, he thought. So did I. Outside, the Colorado night was doing what Colorado nights do in October, pressing cold and enormous against the windows. Indifferent and vast. The fire held. The house held. The woman beside him breathed slowly in her sleep. Caleb Whitaker did not brace himself for morning. He sat in the warmth and the quiet, and for the first time in 11 years he felt, in the house his father had built, and he had repaired, and she had helped him make into something livable. The specific and irreplaceable sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. The accounts could wait until morning. The timber sale letter was already in the post. The north pasture fence still ran along the creek his father had loved. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, and the fire snapped once in the stove. And Evelyn shifted slightly in her sleep, and the house made its familiar sounds around them both. And it was enough. It was for the first time in a very long time. Exactly enough. The timber letter came back in 3 weeks instead of 6. Caleb was in the barn when Evelyn came out with it, not running. Because Evelyn did not run toward things, but walking with the specific pace she used when something required immediate attention. He saw her coming and set down what he was holding. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it. Henderson in Durango was not just interested. Henderson was prepared to pay 40% above what Caleb had estimated the South Ridge timber was worth. Because Henderson had a contract in Denver that needed filling by spring, and the Whitaker timber was exactly the specification he needed, and he needed it now. Caleb read the number twice. That's he stopped. It covers the banknote, Evelyn said. The full amount. Not the partial payment we planned, the full note. She paused. With enough left over to repair the north fence properly. Not patch it, replace it. He looked at her. Your father's fence line, she said. Done right. He looked back at the letter. He was not a man who showed things easily. She knew that by now. Had learned the specific vocabulary of what Caleb Whitaker looked like when something moved through him that he hadn't prepared for. The slight stillness, the way his jaw worked once. The particular quality of silence that was not emptiness, but the opposite, too full for immediate words. She gave him the moment. "How did you know?" he said finally. "Know what?" The Henderson approach. "I've had that timber for 11 years and I never thought to." "You were managing everything alone," she said. "You didn't have time to think about what you had. You were too busy keeping what you had from falling apart." She paused. "That's different now." He looked at her steadily. She held his gaze without looking away, without the slight guardedness she had arrived with, without the careful arrangement of herself that she had worn for the first days like a coat she was not sure she could take off. 6 weeks of Colorado had done something to that guardedness. Not removed it, Evelyn would always be a woman who thought before she opened. And he had come to understand that was not a wall but a quality. A depth, something that meant when she gave you something it was real because she had considered it first. But the coat was off. "Write to Henderson today," she said. "Confirm the terms." Today he agreed. He wrote the letter. She organized the South Ridge timber access. By the end of the week the sale was confirmed, and the banknote was addressed, and the north pasture fence, his father's fence, the one running along the creek that kept things green when everything else went dry, was scheduled for proper replacement before the ground froze solid. Dixon came by on a Saturday, as Dixon did, and Caleb told him about the timber sale, because Dixon would hear about it anyway, and it was better to control the shape of a story than let it find its own shape in other people's mouths. Dixon listened to the numbers and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at the house. "She find that for you?" "We found it together," Caleb said. Dixon chewed on that.
"Your second wife was a different situation," Caleb said.
"Stop using her as a measuring stick for things she has nothing to do with." Dixon looked at him with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something and doesn't want to admit it. Then he looked at the house again, where, through the kitchen window, Evelyn was visible moving between the stove and the table. And his expression went through something complicated. "She's staying," Dixon said. "We're getting married in November," Caleb said. Dixon was quiet, then good. He paused. "She fixed your garden fence, I know. It was bad for 2 years. I saw it every time I came by." He paused. "She fixed it in an afternoon." "Yes." Dixon looked at him one more time. Then he nodded the specific nod that meant he had revised something and was not going to say so directly, and turned his horse and rode out of the yard. Caleb watched him go and thought that Dixon's approval was the last thing he needed and the most satisfying thing he hadn't expected. He went inside and told Evelyn. She said, "He came around faster than I thought." "He's not a bad man," Caleb said. "He's just a man who measures things by what he's already seen." She looked at him across the kitchen. "So was Thomas." "No," Caleb said. "Thomas measured things by what was useful to him. Dixon measures things by what's real. That's different." She considered this. Then she nodded once. "Fair." The wedding was on the 14th of November. They had discussed making it small, and it was small. Ruth had written that she would come. Had in fact written 3 times in the weeks since her visit, with letters that were getting progressively warmer. The careful distance of their early reconciliation, thawing into something that looked, carefully and gradually, like sisterhood resuming. She arrived 2 days before. The ceremony was in the front room of the house, because Evelyn had said she did not want to begin a marriage standing outside in a November wind. And Caleb had agreed immediately, and the front room had been cleaned, and the furniture rearranged. And Ruth had brought dried flowers from Missouri that she had pressed and carried all this way in a flat box between layers of cloth. The minister was a man named Greer who had been serving this county for 20 years, and who had married enough reluctant ranchers and resolute women to recognize, when he saw it, a couple who had already done the hard work before they stood in front of him. Margaret Holt came. Bill Harmon came with his wife. The mail carrier came, which surprised everyone, including the mail carrier. Dixon came and stood at the back and did not say much, and left immediately after with a handshake for Caleb and a bow for Evelyn that was more courtly than anything anyone had expected from him. Ruth stood beside Evelyn, and Caleb stood in front of the minister in the front room of his house and looked at the woman who had burned his letter and come anyway, who had inspected his lumber and corrected his ledger and stood on his porch with her feet square when she needed to, who had slept on his settee without complaint and made breakfast without being asked and asked him, simply and directly, to stay in the room, and he made her a promise. Not the formal words of the ceremony, though he said those too. The promise underneath them, the one he made in the specific silence between "I will" and the next line. Looking at her directly with every boarded-up window in him open. Deliberately open, because she had asked him to open them, and he was done being a man who couldn't. "I see you," he said, without words. "I have been seeing you since the platform, and I will not stop." Evelyn looked back at him, with the unguarded expression, the full one. The one that rearranged everything, and he understood that she was making him the same promise. Greer pronounced them married, Ruth cried. She did it quietly. In the way she cried, but she cried. Bill Harmon said "well done" to Caleb in a voice that meant considerably more than that. Margaret Holt produced a cake that nobody had known she was making, which was the most Margaret Holt thing that had ever happened. And Evelyn laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and said she should have known, and Margaret said she should have, and the two of them looked at each other with the particular warmth of women who have sized each other up and found each other worth the trouble. Later, after everyone had gone and Ruth had gone to the east bedroom, the room with the real ceiling now. Bill Harmon's ceiling, solid above her, Caleb and Evelyn stood in the kitchen that was theirs, and the quiet settled around them. "Well," Evelyn said. "Well," he said. She looked at the kitchen. Then at him. Something moved through her expression, not the complicated exhaustion of what she'd carried here, but something lighter than that. Something new. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. I was afraid." She said it plainly. "On the train. I burned the letter and I bought the ticket, and I told myself I wasn't afraid. But I was. I was very afraid." She paused. "I had made every practical argument to myself, the age, the options, the situation. But underneath all of it, I was afraid that I was doing what I always did. Showing up to something broken and believing I could fix it without being sure anyone actually wanted me there." He looked at her carefully. And then you picked up my bag," she said. "On the platform. You picked it up without being asked, and you didn't say anything about it, and you just carried it." She held his gaze. "I know that seems small, it doesn't," he said. "I'd been carrying my own bag for a very long time," she said. "Not just literally. You picked it up. That was the first thing you did." She looked at him with the door fully open. "I decided then. I didn't know you. I didn't know if any of this would work. But I decided that a man whose first instinct was to carry the bag was a man worth finding out about." He was quiet for a moment. "You decided on the platform," he said. "On the platform," she confirmed. He thought about standing on that platform with his prepared speech, rehearsed for 3 days and discarded in the first 10 seconds. About a woman who stepped off a train with her chin level and looked at him the way she'd already made her decision about something. She'd already decided before they said a word. "I owe the Postal Service an apology," he said. She looked at him. "If the letter had arrived on time," he said, "I would have talked you out of coming." She was quiet for a beat. "Then you would have tried." He looked at her. She was almost smiling. "I had made my decision, Caleb. I was coming. The only question was whether you'd be standing on the platform, or whether I'd have to find the ranch on my own." He stared at her. "You would have come anyway." "Yes, even if I hadn't been there. I burned the letter," she said simply. There was no going back from that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm very glad I was there." "So am I," she said. "You carried the bag." He almost laughed, caught it. "Let it out anyway, the real one, the unplanned one that came from somewhere that had been quiet for too long." And she smiled, the full rearranging one, and for a moment the kitchen was very full of something that neither of them needed to name. Then she picked up the lamp and said, "Come on, then. It's late." He followed her through the house that was his and hers. Past the front room where the ceremony had happened, and the dried flowers Ruth had brought still sat in their arrangement. Down the hallway with its solid walls and its finished ceiling. And the house held around them, the way a house holds when it is being lived in by the right people. Winter arrived properly in December. Not the warning frost of October, but the full Colorado winter that did not apologize, the kind that pressed against windows and tested every joint and found every gap and made demands of a house and the people in it that could not be negotiated with. The Whitaker ranch met them. The root cellar was full. The wood was stacked. The fence lines were solid, the north pasture fence replaced properly with new posts that would hold for 20 years. The cattle rotation Evelyn had suggested in October was running. And the east pasture section she had identified was producing better than the ground it had replaced in the rotation. The accounts were straight, updated weekly in her small precise hand alongside his rougher notations. And the picture they showed was the clearest Caleb had been able to see in years. He told her this one evening in January, when the cold outside was serious and the stove inside was doing its work and they were sitting together in the front room with the lamp between them. "I can see the ranch," he said. "What I mean is I could always see the work. The cattle, the fences, the daily. But I couldn't see the whole thing. Where it was going, whether it was solid or just managing." He paused. "Now I can see it." She looked at him from her chair. "Because of the accounts?" "Because of you," he said. "The accounts are part of it, but you changed how I look at things. You ask questions I wasn't asking. You see things I stopped seeing because they were on the list too long." He paused. "I see the ranch better because I'm seeing it with you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see myself better." He waited. "I spent a long time being capable in service of someone else's life," she said. "The competence was real. I don't mean I was performing it. But it was always in service of arranged around what someone else needed." She looked at him. "Here it's mine. The accounts are mine because we built them together. The garden is mine. The root cellar is mine." She paused. "I'm useful here because I choose to be, not because it's the price of staying." He looked at her across the lamp. "Yes," he said, quietly with everything in it. She nodded. Went back to her book. He went back to his. And the winter moved around the house, and the house held, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more. Because what they had just said was enough, and sometimes enough is the most complete thing there is. The twist came in February. It came in the form of a letter from a land office in Denver. And when Caleb opened it at the kitchen table, with Evelyn across from him, he read it twice before he said anything. "What is it?" she said. He handed it across. She read it. Her expression moved through surprise. Then calculation, then something that settled into a particular stillness. The letter informed Caleb Whitaker that a section of the South Ridge, the section where the timber sale had taken place, had been improperly surveyed in the original 1,871 land grant, and that a corrected survey placed approximately 40 acres of that section in dispute with an adjacent claim filed by a land speculation company out of Denver called the Meridian Land Corporation. 40 acres of the South Ridge, the 40 acres from which the Henderson timber had come. The 40 acres that had paid the bank note and saved the north pasture fence. If the dispute resolved in Meridian's favor, the timber sale proceeds could be subject to claim. Not certain, the letter was careful about that, but possible. Evelyn set the letter down. "How long have they been operating?" she said. "Meridian?" He shook his head. "I've heard the name. They've been buying disputed claims across 3 counties. Wherever there's a survey discrepancy, they move in and file. Do they win? Sometimes." He paused. "The original survey was done in 1871. Surveys from that period are," he exhaled, "not always clean. A man named Croker. He's dead. Land office in Denver. Presumably." She looked at the letter again. "This is what they count on," she said. "The complexity, the time it takes, the cost of fighting it." She looked up. They count on people not having the resources to push back. Yes, he said. That's generally how it works. Do we have the resources? He was quiet for a moment. Then we have something better. She waited. Your handwriting, he said. She looked at him. The accounts you reorganized, he said. When you went through everything from the past 10 years, you found things. Inconsistencies, notations, things I'd recorded and forgotten. He leaned forward. Evelyn, when you went through the summer records 2 years ago, you mentioned there was a notation about a survey correction. Do you remember? She went very still. He watched her working back through it, her memory, which was the kind of specific and organized memory that came from years of keeping careful books. Moving back through the records she had handled. September, she said slowly. A notation in the 1872 column. You'd recorded a payment to a surveying company. Not Croker, a different company. She stood up from the table. The accounts. She went to the shelf. He followed. She pulled the reorganized ledger, the one she had rebuilt from his incomplete records in the first weeks, and opened it to the section she had indexed in her careful hand. Her finger found the notation in 30 seconds. September 4. 1872. Payment to the Morrison Survey Company, Denver. For the purpose of correction survey, South Ridge section. Per county requirement. A correction survey, she said. Someone ordered a correction survey of the South Ridge a year after Croker's original. Your father, it looks like, based on the handwriting. Caleb looked at the notation. It was his father's hand, unmistakable. I've never seen this. It was in the back of the 1872 ledger, she said. The ledger you hadn't opened since. She checked the last entry date in her reorganization notes. Since 1891. He looked at her. If the Morrison survey exists in the Denver land office, she said. And if it corrects the Croker survey, it predates Meridian's claim by 13 years. She paused. That's not a dispute, Caleb. That's a documented correction. He stared at the notation. His father, 1872. A correction survey ordered quietly. Paid for. Recorded in a ledger that had sat on a shelf for over 20 years because there had been no reason to open it and too much else to manage alone. You found this, he said. It was always there, she said. You found it, he said again. She looked at him, with the expression that was becoming one of his most familiar things, the one that was not quite humility and not quite pride, but something in the space between them. The look of a person who has done something real and knows it, and is not going to pretend otherwise, but is also not going to make it larger than it was. Write to Denver, she said. Request the Morrison survey records. If they exist, you file them with the county, and Meridian has no claim. He was already reaching for paper. He wrote 2 letters that afternoon. One to the Denver land office requesting the Morrison survey records. One to a land attorney in Denver whose name Bill Harmon had given him the previous year for a separate matter, and whom he had not needed until now. Evelyn sat across from him while he wrote and did not say anything and did not need to. Because her being there was itself a kind of thinking together that he had come to rely on in a way he had not expected and would not have believed possible 4 months ago. The Morrison survey records arrived in 3 weeks. They existed. They were complete. They had been filed correctly in 1872 and had sat in the Denver land office ever since, waiting for the moment when they were needed. A correction survey, signed by Morrison and 2 witnesses, establishing the South Ridge section boundaries with a precision that made Croker's original look like what it was, the rough work of a man who had been paid to go fast. The land attorney filed the correction survey with the county. Meridian Land Corporation withdrew their claim 6 days later. No explanation. No correspondence. Simply gone, moving on to the next disputed survey in the next county, where someone had not had a wife who reorganized the 1872 ledger. When the withdrawal confirmation arrived, Caleb brought it to Evelyn in the garden, the East Garden. The one she had been on her knees in on the 7th morning. The one that was producing now, properly planted and tended through the fall, and waiting under its winter covering for spring. She read the confirmation. "Said it, your father," she said. Yes, he knew, she said. He knew the Croker survey was wrong and he fixed it, and he wrote it down. She looked at him. He was protecting the land. Even then, Caleb looked at the confirmation in her hand. He didn't know he was protecting it for me. Maybe not, she said. But he was protecting it for whoever came after him. For whoever built their life on it. She paused. He was protecting it for this. Caleb stood in the cold air of February, with his father's correction survey and the withdrawal confirmation and a woman who had found both with the organized attention she brought to everything. And he thought about the north pasture fence line along the creek, and the root cellar that was full, and the accounts that were straight, and the east bedroom with its real ceiling, and the kitchen where two people made breakfast every morning without planning it. And the specific weight of a life that was solid. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "It's cold." In a minute she looked at him. "Evelyn." He met her eyes. "I want to say something." "You're allowed," she said. "I spent 4 years after Clara left believing that the ranch was the problem. That if I fixed enough things, the roof, the fence, the accounts, eventually it would be enough. That the house being finished would solve the thing that was actually wrong." He paused. "The house was never the problem." She was very still. "I was the problem," he said. "A man who didn't know how to let anyone in. Who fixed walls instead of opening windows. Who sent letters asking women not to come because he had convinced himself he was being responsible when actually he stopped. When actually he was afraid." She looked at him with the full attention she gave to everything that mattered. "You burned the letter," he said, "and you came. And in 4 months you have done more to make this ranch what it should be than I managed in 11 years alone. Not because you're more capable than I am, though you are. In several specific areas," she almost smiled, "because a ranch is not a one-person thing. A life is not a one-person thing." He paused. "I know that now. Not because I read it somewhere. Because I watched you fix a garden fence on a Tuesday afternoon and find a survey record in a ledger I hadn't opened since 1891, and stand on a porch with your feet square and send a man away who had no business being here." He looked at her. "You taught me that, Evelyn. That some things you cannot build alone no matter how hard you work." She looked at him for a long moment. "You taught me something too," she said quietly. He waited. "That being capable is not the same as being alone," she said. "That I do not have to choose between being useful and being seen." She paused. "You see me, Caleb. You have from the beginning. I don't know if you know how rare that is." She looked at the ground for a moment. Then back at him. "My whole life I have been competent and present, and I have done the work, and I have believed. Somewhere underneath all of it, that was the only offer I had to make. That was all. I was someone who shows up and does the work." Her voice was very steady, but something underneath it was not. "You never once made me feel that way. Not once in 4 months." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and put his arms around her. And she let him, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder with the specific release of a woman who has been holding something upright for a very long time and has finally decided she can lean. Just for a moment. Then she straightened, pulled back, looked at him with clear eyes. "Come inside," she said. "The stove needs more wood and I am making soup." "All right," he said. They went inside. The spring that year was the best the Whitaker Ranch had seen in a decade. Not by luck, not by accident, by the work of 2 people who had spent a winter learning how to build together, when to divide the work and when to combine it, when to speak and when the silence between them was its own kind of communication, when to push and when to let something rest. The east pasture rotation ran the way Evelyn had designed it. The cattle came through the winter in better condition than any previous year. The kitchen garden, planted in April, was 3 times the size of what had been there before, and planned with a careful attention to what the root cellar needed, and what the table needed, and what had room to grow in Colorado's particular soil. Ruth wrote every 2 weeks now. Sometimes the letters were long. Sometimes they were short. They were always honest, the honest correspondence of two sisters who had finally decided to be true with each other, rather than careful. And the difference showed in every line. Dixon came by in May with a fence question that was not really a fence question, and stayed for 2 hours, talking about the Meridian situations which had become county conversations, and left with the particular expression of a man who has comprehensively changed his mind about something and has decided to behave as though his new opinion was always his position. Bill Harmon brought his wife to Sunday dinner in June, which had never happened in 11 years of working together. Caleb noticed. He said nothing about it, but he noticed. And on a July morning, almost exactly a year since the train had been late, and a woman had stepped onto the platform with her chin level and her bag in her hand, Evelyn found Caleb in the barn at the workbench where she had come to find him months ago with the lantern. And she stood in the doorway until he turned. "I want to show you something," she said. He set down what he was holding and followed her. She led him to the east garden, the one she had been on her knees in on the 7th morning, the one he had crouched beside with borrowed gloves on a day that now felt like a different time. She stopped at the edge of it. He looked. The garden was full. Not full the way a managed garden is full, carefully planned and arranged. Full the way something grows when it has been given the right conditions and left to become what it was meant to be. Green and abundant and various and real, the kind of garden that feeds people through a winter and still has something left over. He started. "That's what a year looks like," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the garden. "When I got here, it was 2 seasons of weeds and hard ground. I got on my knees and I pulled, and you handed me a tool, and neither of us said much, and we worked through it together." She paused. "That's what a year looks like." On the other side of that morning, he stood beside her at the edge of the garden that had been nothing, and was now something. And he thought about the letter he had written, asking her not to come, and the letter she had burned, and the lumber sacking, and the lumber in the barn, and the ledger on the kitchen table, and the east bedroom ceiling, and the porch in the dark, and Thomas Wren's horse in the yard, and the Morrison survey and the 1872 ledger, and the February morning when he had put his arms around her, and she had leaned for exactly 1 moment before straightening. He thought about all of it, the whole accumulated weight of a year, and he thought that there was no single thing you could point to and say, "There." That was the moment it became real. It did not work that way. It worked the way gardens work, slowly underneath, in the dark where nobody watches, and then one day you stand at the edge of it, and it is simply there. Full and present and undeniable. "Evelyn," he said. "Caleb," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for burning the letter." She looked at him with the full expression, the unguarded one. The real one, the one that rearranged everything. "Thank you," she said, "for being on the platform, and standing at the edge of the garden that a year of work had made. In the July morning of a Colorado summer, with the ranch solid around them, and the accounts straight and the fence lines holding, and the north pasture running along the creek his father had loved, Caleb Whitaker reached over and took his wife's hand. She held on, and that was the whole of it. And it was enough, and it was real, and it was theirs.